Hi BFFs! Welcome to BFF Beauty's Folklore Friday. I'm Katina from BFF Beauty, and this is where we meld our love of makeup and the paranormal together, and we just chit-chat about it for a few minutes. So today's story comes to you from Denver, and you must excuse me because I'm having some video trouble, so I've already done my foundation and my eyebrows and some contouring today, but I'll leave in the description everything I've used and am going to use throughout this video. So our story today is the Lost Graves of Denver. Some of you may or may not heard of this story, and I'd like to clear a few things up if you have heard of this story. So this story starts in 1858, where General William Larimer jumped claim of the St. Charles Land Company and decided to establish his own town, thus Denver, Colorado. Now, this land really belonged to the Arapaho Indians, but Larimer just jumped on in there and took over, decided it was his, and he set aside 320 acres for a cemetery, calling it Mount Prospect Cemetery. So this cemetery had a crest of the cemetery up on a hill, and he set aside that crest for the wealthy and influential of Denver. He also set up the paupers and criminals to be buried at the outer edges of it, and then all the middle class people somewhere in between. So the first burial was a man named Abraham K, and he died of a lung infection. But the legend has it that he was not the first, somebody else was, because it was a more exciting legend. But the second burial is a little more, I don't know, just clout behind it for a scary story. So there was a Hungarian immigrant by the name of John Schoeffel, and he came to Denver looking for his brother-in-law, whom he felt he had a score to settle with. I cannot make these even. And people say that they were both prospectors and he was trying to jump his claim, but he says that he treated his sister foul and he came to make amends for that. Either way, he shot and killed him on April 7th, 1859. Now, there wasn't a court in Denver, Colorado at the time. They had to go all the way to Kansas for a trial. So they decided to put together a people's court. I'm trying to make these even. And they found him guilty of murder, and they sentenced him to hang on April 9th, 1859. So it only took them 2 days. And then the man was hung. Him and his brother-in-law were thrown into the same coffin and tossed into the same grave at Mount Prospect Cemetery. They were actually the second and third burials there. Second and third people, I should say. So as time went on, just a little bit of time went on, the cemetery started filling up with just criminals and diseased and, so forth. They didn't really bring in the wealthy or anybody of that nature. They had some middle class families in there, but it was mostly just paupers and criminals and diseased people that were being buried there. So the wealthy people did not want to be buried there. They wanted to go to other cemeteries, more appealing cemeteries. So Larimer's dream of this being a very segregated and beautiful cemetery never happened, and he ended up leaving Denver. When he ended up leaving Denver, he turned the cemetery over. When he turned the cemetery over, he turned it over to a man named John Wally. John Wally was an aspiring undertaker, but he was really a cabinet maker. So you can imagine he was not very good at taking care of a cemetery. And over time, the cemetery just fell to despair. The gravestones were toppling over. People were looting the graves. Cows were grazing in the cemetery. Homesteaders were trying to homestead areas on the 320 acres. It just really turned into a mess. And it was right in the center of Denver. So you can imagine it wasn't the greatest situation for an up-and-coming city. An up-and-coming capital city, really. So the United States signed a peace treaty with the Arapaho Indians in 1860, and they realized that this land really belonged to the Arapaho Indians, so they took back the land and sold it to the city of Denver for $200 in 1860. Well, the city of Denver then renamed it the Denver City Cemetery. They decided to segregate the cemetery at that point, and they segregated it into sections mostly for religious purposes, but it was the Odd Fellows, there was a section for the Masons, there was a section for Roman Catholics, there was a section for the Jewish, the Grand Army of the Republic, and there was a far away section for the residents on what they called Hop Alley. And Hop Alley was the Chinese Oriental place in Denver. So it was the Chinese cemetery put on the outskirts over by the paupers' graves. So that's how they segregated the cemetery when Denver took it over. In 1875, so 15 years later, Denver then sold 20 acres to the Hebrew Burial Society, and they maintained that 20 acres pretty well, but the rest of the cemetery grew into despair, like just tall weeds everywhere, and just really an eyesore. So 1881, seldom was the cemetery ever used. Nobody really went there. Nobody was getting buried there. Quiet pauper graves were being thrown up, you know, nothing significant was going on there, and they really weren't using the cemetery for much. So they set up a hospital for smallpox near the Jewish section of the cemetery. And basically people just came there to die. They would be diseased, some would be elderly, but basically people just came to this hospital to die. So they called it a pest house, you know, like pestilence, a pest house. It was, you know, like I said, just for diseased and like elderly people to go die at. So they started this cemetery area behind the building, and they called it Potter's Field. The Potter's Field was really mass graves of the sick and diseased, smallpox and so forth going on there. So that's a little scary, right? I mean, it's just mass graves. There's terrible record keeping, so we don't really know how many people or who all is there. You know, we don't really know that. But in the late 1880s, the Realtor Commission of Denver, they lobbied for a park to be there, to relocate the cemetery and for a park to be there. And our Governor Teller, I believe was his name, Senator Teller, he persuaded Congress to grant the relocation of the cemetery by promising to name it Congress Park, which he did. And promptly, January 25th, 1890, the Congress ordered a vacay of the premises. And families had 90 days to move the bodies of their loved ones. 90 days, that's it, to find somewhere to exhume the body, find somewhere to take it to, and rebury it. Now, some people, you know, they came through, they got their family members, they did what they were supposed to do, they got them out of there, they buried them at another cemetery, Riverside, or they moved them to a different area. The Chinese, they had their bodies shipped to China, back to the homeland. The Catholics, they sold the Catholic part to the Archdiocese, and they left that a cemetery, which they renamed Mount Calvary, and that stayed a Catholic cemetery. But vagrants and criminals and the paupers, they all still remained there. So the city of Denver had to do something about that. So they contracted a guy, E.P. McGovern, to move all of these bodies, and they paid him $1.90 a head to move them. And he was to put them in a new box, a new casket, and move them to the Riverside Cemetery. That was his job. That's all he had to do, right? Well, he realized that he wasn't really turning a profit. In the first couple days, everything went great, and there were a lot of people there standing around watching, waiting for them to exhume these bodies and see what was going on. Well, he started hacking up the bodies and putting them in smaller child-sized coffins so that he could bury more in to the same graves and make a bigger profit. Well, the health inspector got word of it. The newspaper ratted him out because, you know, people were all around seeing what was going on. And so he ended up losing his contract. They ended up putting a fence around it, and nobody ever picked up the contract again, therefore leaving 2,000 bodies there. 2,000 bodies still buried under there. So in 1894, 1 year later, they started grading and leveling the land. In 1902, the graves were finally filled in that had been looted and dug up and bones scattered everywhere. You know, they had finally filled those in. Most of them they planted shrubs in to make this beautiful Congress Park. In 1907, the park was complete, and never did they move any more bodies until 2010 when they were putting in some irrigation pipes and they dug up 4 more. But it goes on from there. The Chessman family, they donated a marble pavilion for the area, provided that they make it Chessman Park. So there now is Chessman Park, which was the pauper's grave area, and there is Congress Park. Then the Archdiocese moved all of the Catholic graves to a different area, and they sold that property back to the city of Denver, which then made the Botanical Gardens. So there are rumors that there's a lot of activity going on there around those areas, in the residential areas, all through that park. The park, Chessman Park, is located at Franklin and 8th Streets, and it's open until 11 p.m. So from dawn until 11 p.m., you can go check this out yourself. But if you want to know some stuff going on there, somebody made a movie in 1980 called The Changeling, and that is by Russell Hunter. Russell Hunter actually made this movie from his experiences in a mansion just on the edge of Chessman Park. And it's some pretty dark stuff. Like, have you guys ever seen that red ball bouncing down the stairs in the horror movies? It's become such a classic, scary situation. That's him. That happened to him on the edge of Chessman Park in a mansion that he lived in there called the Henry Treat Rogers Mansion, which has now been torn down. But there are a lot of pictures. There are a lot of things that have gone on there. I myself can say, I just went back through some pictures that I had with my family at the Botanical Gardens, and I did catch entities in those pictures, which I never saw until I read this story. So if you guys are interested in just checking this out, there's also a Chinese garden place in the Botanical Gardens, and that area is really dark and creepy feeling. And I never knew why until I heard this story. So if you've ever been to the Botanical Gardens, go to the Botanical Gardens. Been to Chessman Park? Well, go to Chessman Park. Check it out. Take some pictures. Let's see what you can catch. Super interested. It's super local, super open. And I bet if you talk to a few people that just strolled around there, they'd have some stories to tell about it. Like, one man talks about a guy who came up in a hospital gown asking for a cigarette and if they had seen any of the people that had stabbed him. And then he just walked away and vanished. This man swears by this story. So, I don't know. Go by there. See if you can find some things out. I'm going to tell you this. Next time I'm in Denver, why do I always do this when I'm talking? Next time I'm in Denver, I'm going to check it out. I'm going to go back and pay attention this time, because I tell you, there were some things in the pictures when I went back and looked at them from being at Botanical Gardens. So I think it would be a really cool place to check out. You really should. It's quite a cool story. Children playing, all kinds of things. So that's it for today, guys. Thank you for hanging out with me for Folklore Friday. Remember to like, remember to share, remember to subscribe, and we'll see you again next Friday. Thanks for watching, friends.